школе в городке сдавал. Наркота, отстойник класса, учит вас школа Харбаса. Нам харбасерам давно не в тему данное говно. Проживай боб и матрас в наших плеерах Харбас. СПБ и МСК, наш проект два города. Пациков не брет обстеп, через бочку рубит клэп. Лютый стиль без препаратов, бутерат для деградатов. Кто харбасить перестал, знайте все наркотикал. Пацаны наркотикал, в школе в городке сдавал. Наркота, отстойник класса, учит вас школа Харбаса. Нам харбасерам давно не в тему данное говно. Проживай боб и матрас в наших плеерах Харбас. СПБ и МСК, наш проект два города. Пациков не брет обстеп, через бочку рубит клэп. Лютый стиль без препаратов, бутерат для деградатов.
Okay, everyone, let's get started. Welcome to our first lecture, our first comprehensive lecture in this year's series on post-communist transitions. And as I mentioned in the introduction, I am focusing this time around exclusively on the countries of the former Soviet Union. The 15 countries that emerged in the latter half of 1991 with varying degrees of independent sovereignty, which includes Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. I think I got all of them in there. And I begin where I usually begin, with a big picture scenario, right? Hence the title of this lecture, The Former Soviet Union 30 Years Later, right? It's sort of a where are they now? What have they done? How have they gotten to where they have? So this involves really just as much an attention to historical development as to, modern political analysis. And, if you know me, you know that I'm a big proponent of this belief that in order to do good political science, in order to be a good, political analyst, you have to understand history. You have to understand where people are coming from and what institutional, structural, and conditional environments that they had to deal with. So, with this in mind, I want to look at the following themes over the next hour to hour and a half here. The first is the nature of state collapse and its political, economic, social, cultural, and institutional consequences. Of course, in this sense, I'm talking about the nature of Soviet collapse and the fallout that all of these countries, in fact, a wider collection of post-communist countries from Central Europe and the Balkans, had to face throughout the tumultuous decade of the 1990s. That gives us the ability to understand the relative strength of the security sector. And this is something that I don't think gets enough attention, and I think is a very, very important element here. And that is, parts of the Soviet Union didn't really collapse so much as they just kind of devolved to the republic level, which becomes the independent state level. The security sector, and that is sort of the invisible yet all presence felt apparatus of various successor organizations of the KGB, still exist in many of these countries today. The third is the emergence of hybrid regimes, and this is a term that we use within political science to roughly describe countries that aren't necessarily authoritarian in the classic sense, but aren't fully consolidated democracies either, right? A hybrid regime is exactly as it sounds. It's some kind of amalgamated mishmash of a government that has elements of democracy, specifically procedural elections, while using that to somehow prop up, legitimize, and entrench one group of political cadres that use their notion of democratic legitimacy to entrench themselves in power and, effectively steal as much as possible from the state. And finally, I want to examine the failure of the so-called color revolutions, another term that we use in the literature, which is, just very briefly explain, a series of protests that begin with legitimate and genuine grievances among sectors of the population that kind of grow and grow and grow to gain popularity, especially among Western political and media outlets to give the impression, right, that the country in question is undergoing another major revolution. Sometimes the entrenched and targeted government is dislodged. But the problem that we get is that the new government that comes in, the new leaders, the new caretaker government, many of them promising reforms, within 6 to 8 months, at the absolute best, become just as corrupt and just as removed from public scrutiny as the previous government. So we're really not talking about a revolution in which the ways of doing things are changed, so much as we're just talking about people in power dislodging previous people in power from feeding off the gravy train because a new group of people now want to take their turn, right, at the gravy train. And what this has also shown, especially within the last, let's say, 15 years or so, is that some countries have seen what is happening in others. So specifically, color revolutions took place in Ukraine, Georgia, and Kyrgyzstan. And how has this kind of led to a learning curve of political power brokers in other countries like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Russia to retain their authority and leverage? How can certain entrenched governments and their cooperative relationship with the erstwhile security sector kind of remain one step ahead of challenges to their authority and self-proclaimed legitimacy? Right, so these are the four themes that I want to look at in this first comprehensive lecture. And for those of you that are enrolled in this class at Rutgers, right, there are 4 assigned readings for this week, which I expect you to have completed. Those of you that are listening in on YouTube or Patreon, the P.J. O'Rourke article, The Godfather Decade, is one that is readily available, and I will provide a link to the article below. The other 3 articles, Henry Hale's 25 Years After the USSR, What's Gone Wrong, Theodore Tudorio's Rose, Orange, and Tulip, The Failed Post-Soviet Revolutions, and the jointly written article by Abel Polese and Donacha Obiachwin, The Color Revolution, Virus and Authoritarian Antidotes, Political Protest and Regime Counterattacks in Post-Soviet Spaces. I have them all available on PDF. If anybody would like to read them, please just send me an email to my email address that I've also put in the description below, and I'll be happy to forward those on to you. All 4 of these articles I have used repeatedly in this class, and if you kind of look, they are a little dated. The oldest one, O'Rourke's article, is almost 25 years old itself, but they're all very good. They're all incredibly informative, and as I also mentioned in the introduction, sometimes newer articles just simply don't have the same amount of importance and analytical depth as the ones that have been read and understood and are familiar in the field. So I like to stick with the ones that count rather than some of the newer ones. All right, anyway, with that said, let's move on to the topics at hand here. And, in giving, I guess, an overall snapshot of the post-Soviet world in 2023, I don't think that I'm going to surprise a lot of people when I say that, the state of affairs as far as democracy is concerned is at best stalled. More realistically, I think there's large parts of the former Soviet world that, never even bothered to initiate that. So, we kind of see, when we look at all 15 former republics, extremely limited amounts of democratic development. In fact, to be even more specific here, the only exceptions to this are in the 3 Baltic countries, right? Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which, as I also mentioned, are seen in many academic and policy circles as not really post-Soviet anymore. Right, they're kind of given, honorary placement among Central European states, like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, among others. The 3 Baltic countries were far more organized and prepared for what they saw as the inevitable fragmentation of the Soviet Union. And at least Lithuania had broken away well before the August coup had happened. So, in many cases, the three Baltic countries had left the circus before it had completely collapsed. In the ensuing 30 years, they have gone through all of the necessary political and economically structural reforms to get into NATO, as well as the European Union, right? They joined the European Union in 2004, the first major expansion of the EU into what was then the post-communist world, and never really looked back. As far as three other countries, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, most policymakers ascribe some kind of nascent democratic character to all three countries. And not surprisingly, as I already mentioned, Georgia and Ukraine had experienced at least one color revolution of their own. Now, this gives us, the ability to note a number of unique features in these three countries, right? Some type of nascent, independent civil society, some type of autonomous political society, but not enough to tilt the balance definitively in favor of pro-European liberal democratic consolidation. And while the European Union has given some kind of attention to all three of them as possible members in the future, we're talking a distant future. But also, not surprisingly, all three states tend to be geographically located along Europe's eastern frontier. So at the absolute best, we can talk about, liberal democratic factions within three countries that are still caught between, two different spheres of political interest. Now, for much of the rest of the former Soviet Union, here I'm talking about the other 12 to 9 republics, former republics, we note the persistence of electoral strongmen and political power brokers operating within a security state. Now, as I already mentioned, right, the pervasive security apparatus in most of these countries forms the foundation of order and the rule of law, in which case opportunistic politicians, and here I'm really talking about people like Vladimir Putin, Alexander Lukashenko, Nursultan Nazarbayev, those are the three big ones, ally themselves with their respective security systems, which create at best hybrid regimes, but more realistically characterize each of their respective countries as stabilitocracies. Right? And this is another term that we sort of create and throw around to describe countries in which the government prioritizes national security, the rule of law, and, stability over political rights, civil liberties, and other types of liberal democratic ideals. And within this, we also note a loose but discernible model of economic corporatism, right? And this is largely taken from the Chinese model, in which economic reform is prioritized over political liberalization. So it's within this combination of structures that we find the persistence of patterns of patrimonialism and clientelism. In other words, corruption, nepotism, connections get you everywhere, right? It's not so much what you know, but who you know ascends you up the ladder of power and authority. The effect I've already mentioned of color revolutions tend to be more performative than substantive, which unfortunately produces a number of also what we refer to in the field as rotten transitions. Now, this is, widely understood to be some kind of post-authoritarian regime change amid weak social capital. So in other words, what we witnessed in Georgia in 2003, what we saw in Ukraine first in 2004 and then again in 2014, and what we saw in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, and again another 5 years later in 2010, was the power of protest politics the power of a restless citizenry collectively fed up with the current people in power, but the inability of transforming that collective grievance into any kind of organized political leadership, beyond just giving a couple of other political opportunists within the country a chance to ride the coattails of public anger, contribute to the overthrow of the unpopular regime, but then, as I've already said, just pick up where the old regime left off. And in many situations, this is especially true when we look at Georgia and Ukraine, many of the new political leaders, the ones that are proclaiming a new day, a new page, an age of reform, I mean, they basically got where they were by being loyalists of the old regime that they, vocally worked to overthrow. Right. So color revolutions are, I would say more performative, right, than substantive. And, a lot of this is also taking place amid persistent patterns of modernization without democratization, right? I just previously mentioned here that a lot of these countries are certainly modernizing. Their capital cities are turning into cosmopolitan urban centers. New building projects, new infrastructure, roads and highways and bridges, and many countries are opening up international universities. This is in no small measure due to, sort of a resurgent Russia and an emergent China. This is really a good focus of sort of the new Central Asia, but we're really looking at economic development while political development remains still tightly controlled, right? So we're not talking about democratization per se, but instead we are looking at what is appearing to be a rather successful strategy, at least in the short term, in which the people in power are providing a number of perks, monetary, economic, material, consumerist, to society. And if that's enough to kind of buy off their potential grievance against corruption, nepotism, and favoritism, well, then mission's successful, right? If we can effectively modernize the country, and increase the purchasing power of the majority of citizens without having to do anything by pluralizing politics, well, not only have we succeeded in replicating a strategy that so far has worked in China, but we remain in power, right? And this is one of the big things with hybrid regimes, is that those in power do everything possible to remain in power, right? And if that means expanding certain rights and freedoms every so often, they're going to do so, but as long as they get the credit for it, right? So the post-Soviet world is one that outside the Baltics is still heavily managed by a small percentage of people that retain significant amounts of power, prestige, and leverage, which, helps us to explain why, according to Freedom House, much of the former Soviet Union remains not free. Now, I'm not a big fan of Freedom House because I oftentimes find that their quantitative numbers don't necessarily meet up with qualitative data. But I like to use Freedom House, at least in the beginning, to give an overall picture of the scenario. And if you kind of look here, Freedom House, if you don't know it, is a think tank funded by a number of Western governments to measure, surprise, surprise, the amount of freedom in the world for each country. And they have annual reports every year where they provide assessments of whether democracy is growing or declining. And each country is given a numerical rating of 1 to 7, right? 1 being the most free and 7 being the most not free. And Freedom House will divide this up even further into 3 categories. Free, in which numerical scores of 1 to 2.5 are given. Partly free, which is 3 to 5.5. And not free, which is 6 to 7. Now, Freedom House measures these along 2 general axioms: the amount of political rights and civil liberties that exist in each country. Now, both of these measurements are given 1 to 7 ratings of their own. And these 2 ratings are then averaged together, and boom, there is your overall assessment. So countries that are in green are considered free, yellow, partly free, and the big depressing sea of purple are the not free. So when it comes to freedom in the former Soviet Union, we really only have 3 success stories, right? The Baltics, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. Estonia effectively just emerged from the former Soviet Union pretty much with all green in front of it. Lithuania, Latvia struggled for a couple of years, but all 3 of these countries are widely regarded to be liberal consolidated democracies. The rule of law takes precedence over personalized politics. All 3 of these countries are long-standing members of NATO and the European Union. So they don't really get the same amount of attention and scrutiny as the rest, right? They're kind of seen as success stories, over and done with here. Not surprisingly, the only former Soviet countries that are partly free tend to be geographically located closer to Europe than Asia. And here I'm talking about Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and Armenia. Again, Ukraine is still given a partly free rating, although the last Freedom House report has noted that democracy and freedom have deteriorated significantly since the outbreak of the war. But we'll see what next year's rating gives it. I find it a little generous to give Ukraine a partly free rating today, given some of the draconian measures that the Zelensky government has taken against much of the political opposition. And the same kind of goes for Moldova and Georgia as well. But, when you compare them to the near absence of political pluralism across the board in the rest of the former Soviet Union, you can kind of understand that, right? So, the not free states are Russia, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. And some of which, like Turkmenistan, are just given 7s across the board. Right? We're talking full authoritarian, little to no political pluralism whatsoever. And then for whatever strange reason, there's like Mongolia just sort of hanging out there in the middle of a sea of authoritarian purple, just kind of doing its own democratic thing, which I always like pointing out. My students will look at this if I have a real-time class and say, what's Mongolia's story? How are they able to be democratic? And just as a little side note here, one of the perks about living and working in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, is that I have a friend and colleague of mine who is from Mongolia, fellow faculty member. And I asked him about this in the beginning of the spring semester of this year. I said, so what's up with Mongolia, right? Why is Freedom House giving it this positive democratic rating? And he kind of smiles and says, don't read too much into this. The one thing that makes Mongolia stand out from all of its neighbors is that it does have clear political pluralism, right? There's 2 viable political parties, the Mongolian People's Party, which is the old communists, and the Democratic Party, which is some kind of right-of-center, pro-capitalist, neoliberal political party. And they both kind of take turns being in power. They're both widely seen as corrupt and inept, but they keep getting voted out of power by a disgruntled electorate who then votes in the other party in response. And then that other party once again disappoints and they get voted out and the new one comes in. So as far as Freedom House is concerned, oh, look at that, party turnover. This is absolutely fantastic, right? Forget the fact, right, that both of these parties are very oligarchic and unbelievably corrupt, but it's the idea that the Mongolian electorate has a true opportunity of deciding which of the 2 corrupt parties that they want governing them for the next 5 years or so. So, there is your democratic exception, which is, again, one of the reasons why I'm like, Freedom House is okay, but take their findings with, a grain of salt. But sticking with this, right? If we were to chart, let's say, the evolution of freedom in these countries. And, no, we did not switch to a Pro Tools tutorial, although I kind of like the retro 80s look that I did with the chart here. We get a sense that if we were to map all 15 of the former Soviet countries here, they're sort of all over the map, right? 7 here being the least free, and 1 being the most. And if we were to somehow color code this a little bit, green being free, yellow being partly free, and red being not free, yes, a very small group, try to guess which ones they are, those are the Baltics, make it into the free zone. And then the partly free, not free are kind of, half and half. There's a lot of mixture here in the early 90s, but then things begin to stabilize by the 2000s. So we find that a number of countries that are in the partly free or not free remain so and remain relatively unchanged for a number of years, which means that a lot of these countries are stable. Right? They're stable, they're secure, but it doesn't necessarily mean that political rights and civil liberties guarantee that stability. Now, if we were to just remove the Baltics and look at what we really consider the former Soviet Union, right? The other 12 republics, none of them, right? None of them today or have ever been free, right? If we color code this again, there's a brief period that Freedom House gives to Ukraine in the mid-2000s that, again, there's rationales behind this, but Ukraine quickly moves back into the not free camp. So much of the non-Baltics still have their democratic work cut out for them. Now, the 3 Baltic countries themselves have, for the most part, been solved, right? In the initial period in 1991, they all begin as free states. Lithuania and Latvia, for a brief period, are in the partly free, but they have all gravitated into the free area. Now, again, I kind of say this with a grain of salt, because the Baltic countries are considered free, at least as far as procedural democracy and structural democracy are concerned. There's no personalized politics in which a party exists for the sake of one demagogue. So there are political parties that operate along different ideologies. There is party turnover. There is political pluralism. There are significant amounts of political rights and civil liberties. Now, this is enough for Freedom House to, give them the green light. What we have found in the last year and a half or so, especially with the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, is that all 3 of these countries are some of the most vocal war hawks in NATO in terms of bringing the war into Russia, getting NATO directly involved, and making a number of internal decisions, rather controversial decisions, that stigmatize and target their Russian-speaking minority communities. And I'm not talking about Russians that moved there in the last couple of years. I'm talking about Russians that have lived there since the Soviet Union. They pay their taxes, they have Baltic country passports, they are citizens of these countries. But the Russian language, Russian history has been increasingly stigmatized. Latvia has gone so far as to almost criminalize the celebration of May 9th as Victory Day, which among many people in the former Soviet Union is a major holiday. So yeah, these countries can be classified as democracies, at least as far as structure. But democracy as practice is still something that is up for debate. And here's where it gets a little interesting, because if we were to separate, right, if we were to separate democracy in terms of measuring it by structure and practice, yes, the Baltics clearly are structurally democratic. The rest of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, however, right, tend to lack that democratic structure, but there are signs of practice. There are signs of, let's say, behavioral and attitudinal and cultural patterns that would work well within a democracy. We just don't have the rule of law, and we don't have established political parties to make those attitudes more legally represented. So in the meantime, right, we have to kind of work with what we have. And that is when we look at, let's say, Moldova and the Caucasus, And I put Moldova in the Caucasus not because it's part of the region, but because Moldova is just kind of by itself. It doesn't really have a region that we can lump it with other countries. About half of them are in the partly free. Azerbaijan is, for the most part, in the not free, and it has certainly regressed even further over the last couple of years, to which the last 2 years Azerbaijan is given a full rating of 7. So we're not even talking about hybrid regimes so much as full-blown authoritarian. Georgia, Armenia, and Moldova are within, right, that amalgamated hybrid mix. And then when we look really at the big ones, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, Belarus is widely regarded as one of the last remaining authoritarian states in Europe. Alexander Lukashenko has been the political strongman since 1994. So, he's effectively been around well before most people even knew who Vladimir Putin was. But not surprisingly, right? Not surprisingly here, according to Freedom House data, and I don't think many will really disagree with this. In the last couple of years, Freedom House has designated both Belarus and Russia as truly authoritarian states, even though there are political parties that exist in Russia today. They don't have much exposure. They don't have a lot of membership. In fact, I'll even go so far as to say that the largest political party outside of Putin's United Russia Party is the old Communist Party, which doesn't really say much, considering that some of the youngest members of that party are in their mid-40s. So what does that have to say about other erstwhile pro-democratic, pro-European parties? They're atomistic at the absolute best. So, in this sense, Freedom House has designated both Russia and Belarus as more not free than partly free. Now, Ukraine has been the one country that had some potential in the mid-2000s, where it was for a couple of years regarded as free, but in the loosest sense of the word. Since then, right, Ukraine remains in this hybrid regime model, and the last figures, which reflected 2022, see that it is losing some degrees of its freedom by moving more into the 4 as opposed to the 3.5. It's going to be interesting to see what they are given in 2023. So we'll have to wait for next year for the information to come out. But, right now, the Zelensky government has done two things that raise red flags. One is designate any political opposition that even remotely questions the narrative of the war as pro-Russian and treasonous. Now, that even includes parties that are looking for some negotiated solution. So this has stigmatized not only political parties, but has led to the targeting of many political leaders. The second one, and this is one where probably Freedom House will note more, is that in the last week, 2 weeks or so, Zelensky has actually said that he is not in favor of holding elections in Ukraine until the war is over. Now, that includes both presidential and parliamentary. So if democratic elections across the board are going to be suspended for the indefinite future, that is undoubtedly going to be a major blow for Ukraine's democracy rating. So it remains to be seen what next year's rating will give the country. And then when we get to Central Asia, this is probably the most depressing. This is where you want to pour out a vodka in your piala and cry in it. With the exception of Kyrgyzstan, most of the countries have remained either at the upper end of the partly free or well within the not free for years, if not decades. Starting off, one of the easiest ones is Turkmenistan. Like Turkmenistan is kind of like the North Korea of the former Soviet Union, the North Korea of Central Asia. I probably have already mentioned, it is actually easier at this point for an American to go to North Korea then Turkmenistan. I ought to know because it's the one stand that I haven't been to, and it's not because I didn't want to. But the border is just shut. The border has been closed for the last couple of years since the COVID outbreak. And we have diplomatic relations with the country, but it is just an overwhelmingly oppressive government led by one cult of personality president after another. For many years, Uzbekistan, under the longtime leadership of Islam Karimov, followed in Turkmenistan's footsteps. It wasn't as ridiculously famous as it was. Uzbekistan was kind of a closed-off, repressive country without any of the YouTube charisma. It has, since Mirziyoyev succeeded power in 2016, improved somewhat. Yes, it went from an unbelievable 7 out of 7 to, are you ready for this, a huge democratic jump into the 6.5 category here. Kyrgyzstan, on the other end of the spectrum, as I mentioned, has much more dynamics to it, especially in the first couple of years, because its first president, Askar Akayev, was not a political power broker, but an academic, an intellectual. He was removed from power in 2005. By that point, he had become sort of an entrenched political oligarch. But Kyrgyzstan does not have the same type of unified pervasive security apparatus that other post-Soviet countries do, which, at least up until the last couple of years, afforded the country some kind of political dynamism. Less to do with pluralism and more to do with just regional political warlordism. But that's about as good as you're going to get for Central Asia. And then when it comes to Tajikistan and Kazakhstan, they are kind of skirting the border between upper levels of partly free and lower level not free. But in all 5 countries, right, in all 5 countries, political rights and civil liberties, at least institutionally speaking, are very, very limited. And while you may get the feel of some type of freedom and urban cosmopolitanism in their respective capital cities or secondary cities, it's much of the rest of the country that kind of remains off the grid and years behind, infrastructurally, attitudinally, and behaviorally. So given these figures, which range from less than stellar to chronically problematic, right? We need to take a step back here and assess, right, the post-Soviet world in the years immediately following federal collapse, and note that there was a pervasive political, economic, and social fallout. In other words, most of the population of the Soviet Union neither foresaw nor wanted the country to disintegrate. I think that there is this assumption among many in the West that the population was happy that this oppressive government was finally over and that they could rejoice in their newfound freedoms. The problem is that even those that were celebrating the end of the Soviet Union now had to face the Monday morning reality of new security dilemmas. And, it's one thing to go to bed in one country and wake up in another one, right? You wake up realizing that your republic is now an independent state. Who takes over the day-to-day responsibilities? How do things happen? We're not just simply talking about a political fallout, but we're also talking about an economic collapse. I mean, ultimately, and I will go so far as to say this, when we talk about the Soviet Union collapsing, we really are talking about the end of the political and economic power monopoly that the Communist Party had. And within that vacuum, really 2 things take its place. The first, on the political side, are regional party bosses that suddenly become warlords and oligarchs, right? So from like former local Communist Party bosses to the new God Emperor of one's country. And the second one is, and this is something that happened across much of the post-communist world, is the notion of economic shock therapy. There's an article that was published in The Economist in January of 1990. So we're talking like real super Monday morning, 8 o'clock, new year, new decade, new everything, right? The Soviet Union hadn't even collapsed yet. There's an article published by Jeffrey Sachs, interestingly titled "What Is to Be Done," sort of taken from the, from the Lenin essay. And what is to be done about these newly emerging post-communist transitioning states? And primarily we're talking about Eastern Europe, but eventually this extends to the former Soviet Union. And what is to be done more so economically than politically? Now, Sachs is regarded as one of the pioneers of economic shock therapy, which is the idea of just forcing countries into the free market as quickly and as unconditionally as possible, right? So there's no transition period, there's no third way socialism, there's no Yugoslav self-management. It's just kind of like, hey, you want to know how to swim? I'm going to throw you into the lake. And if you sink, self-preservation will, take over, and hopefully you'll, bob up to the top here, and survival instincts will kick in. It's interesting because Sachs, at this point, has pretty much gone to repudiate almost all of that, almost come to apologize for being so glib in thinking that the free market will solve all of one's problems. But this was the model that was effectively imposed on much of the Soviet Union at that time, particularly Russia, Ukraine, among others. So shock therapy is, in so many words, become capitalist in 3, 2, 1, and go, right? And if someone's saying, hey, is there an instruction manual? You'll figure it out as you go along. Are there any fail-safes? Nope, no fail-safes. It's basically economic Darwinism, which, ironically enough, for free market proponents in the West who, made their millions and are now, corporate giants, they never had to work in this, right? If you kind of work in this scenario, it sort of creates numerous security dilemmas, which alongside of that is, buttressed against weak leadership. As I said, the Soviet Union may have fragmented, and various movements decided to work on dissolving the country, but there was really no major consensus with the population, which, if you think about this, the population is never really considered in all of this. But in hindsight, the majority of the Soviet Union, and this includes Central Asia as well, sort of wishes that there was if nothing else, more of a coordinated dissolution. But history rarely, if ever, plans and coordinates these things. So what we find in the early 90s are emergent leaderships that are weak and are trying to find their footing amid a retention of Soviet-era bureaucracy and security apparatus. So, here again is what I've been trying to say. The Soviet Union collapses really only on the outside. But internally, and this is something that happens more often than not in transitioning states, the bureaucracy, the security apparatus, the internal institutional mechanisms remain relatively unchanged. And we're only changing the outside facade. We're changing logos and flags, but the way in which things are still done remains the same. This is especially true when it comes to the security apparatus, which ended up assuming, very quietly, but assuming control over the day-to-day lives of everyone and everything. So by the mid to late 90s, we see very clearly that power and position are protected by a series of hidden networks, which, this kind of ranges on the notion of conspiracy theories, but, it's more fact than fiction. But the KGB effectively fragments into a number of succeeding organizations, depending upon the former republic. But many of these, newly acquired security heads are simply old KGB members. And they still retain their communication, their network of cooperation and alliance. And so in this sense, one gets to power through co-opting and working with these security networks. So very early on, it became pretty clear that national security was going to be placed in a more paramount position than civil liberties and due process, which is not necessarily a particular thing to the former Soviet or post-communist world. Like any country undergoing some kind of revolutionary change is going to realize, maybe after a weekend of partying that the old order is removed, that security is absolutely paramount. And as much as this might be uncomfortable for the big proponents of liberal democracies to consider, civil liberties can simply be taken away with the absence of national security. Now, mind you, national security can oftentimes stifle and prevent civil liberties from growing as well. But the general understanding is that national security is the primary objective, and political rights, civil liberties, and all the other things that go with democracies, whether they are simply electoral or the more advanced liberal democracies, are cosmetic luxuries that can come in a couple of years. Now, this is not all that surprising, right? We got to remember, we're talking about countries that are emerging, some for the first time ever. So the first thing, you don't want to put, the cart before the horse here. But there's another issue here, and that is, okay, if we understand, you have to kind of build the structural foundations of the state first, and then we can decide what color paint we want for the walls or what kind of furniture we want, which is more a way of interior decorating via democracy. When does that transition happen? Like, when do we make that move? Right? How long can we play the national security card? And more to the point, right, there's always the idea that people in power are going to just simply prolong that leverage. They can make the promise that democracy is down the road, it's the next year or whatever, and it's easy for existing political oligarchs who have never experienced competitive politics to say, once I retire. But there is a growing patronage network of people that don't want to give up their privileged positions. And eventually this is going to get noticed by some of the more, intellectually advanced members of the public, especially when they begin to see that other countries, particularly those in Eastern Europe, are progressing at a faster rate, right? So we take a look at what's happening in the Baltics, in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, and others, and let's say that you are an intellectual, a journalist living in, Ukraine or Georgia or Russia for that matter, right? I mean, Russia has its own advanced intellectual base, and you say, well, if they can do it, why can't we? Right? So this is going to create sort of its own problems in and of itself with a restless citizenry wondering, well, when? When are things going to get better? When can we start openly organizing to voice our own grievances? And it doesn't necessarily have to be open protest against the government. It's just simply a way of wanting to let our collective voices be heard. And suddenly, these people find themselves caught between supporting governments that are either restorative, which is, bring back as much of the stability and assurance of the old regime as possible, static, in the sense of, don't rock the boat, things are, fine as they are, translated as we are doing good, the rest of you can, doesn't matter, or truly reformative governments, right, that want to make that leap of faith and say, okay, if now, then, if not now, then never. Let's, make the next 5 years or so into a series of major structural and institutional efforts of transformation. Yes, we understand it's going to be problematic. It's going to be painful. We're going to take a lot of risks. But the payoffs are going to be far better than if we sit and do nothing. And this, of course, is also felt, not completely, but certainly visibly, measurably seen between age and generation differentials. And this is something that almost always happens, right? The younger generation wants change. They want change fast and now. The older generation is either going to go into one of two categories. A, This is as good as it's going to get, so don't try to ask for anything more because you're going to lose more than gain. And then you're going to get the pensioners. And you're going to get the older folks, what I lovingly refer to as the babushka dedushka contingency, that will do nothing else but look at the current situation and say how crappy it is, and say, if only we can go back to the Soviet Union. And this is something that many people in power in the 90s were able to exploit. And that is the idea that the majority of the population did not want the Soviet Union to collapse. And the older one got, the more nostalgic one got. And this is especially true as year after year, people began to see the difference, the rising cost of goods, the decrease in the standards of living, and people thought, was it worth throwing the whole country away? So people in power, especially if they are connected with a security apparatus that ensures their political leverage, can make these promises to the citizenry by saying the first thing that we need to do is clamp down on all of the agitators and the traitors and the internal contagions of the country, which of course run the gamut from political extremists to idealistic reformers, right? And all of this is going to just bring nothing but additional chaos and uncertainty. And look, nothing, and I mean nothing, drove that point home more than the negative effects of shock therapy, right? As I've already mentioned, this is the chosen model, apparently, in the 90s and even into the early 2000s for political and economic transformation. The age of globalization happens just a couple of years after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, right? The rise of the digital age, the rise of the internet, the triumph of free market capitalism, and, more to the point, it's a triumph of capitalism without having to worry about Marxism or socialism providing logical counter-arguments against it. I've said in some of my more animated moments that the best thing that ever happened in the 20th century, and I say this with full knowledge of all of the events that happened, but one of the best things that ever happened, especially to the United States and Western Europe in the 20th century, was simply the existence of the Soviet Union. Like just the existence of the Soviet Union as a political, ideological, economical, and psychological counterbalance to anyone thinking that a free market will invariably give you free politics. Doesn't happen. It does not happen. The golden age of American manufacturing, post-war European growth, took a lot of social democratic policies into account. In other words, the working class was taken care of, wages were properly increased in terms of cost of living, unions, were, if not allowed, they were, accepted as a fact of life. It was basically a way in which one could live the life of a blue-collar working class member and still live a relatively good life. And in many cases, the understanding was that the Soviet Union would always provide more of an extremist counter-argument to that could empower, mobilize, radicalize the working classes even more. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, we didn't have to worry about that anymore, right? The only other remaining major communist country was China, and they're full-blown engaged in state-driven corporatism here. So, in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War ending, there was this, 10 to 15 year period in the 90s in which the United States sees itself as the last man standing. And so for whatever socioeconomic and sociopolitical turmoil that racked the post-communist world, these were the good old times as far as the U.S. was concerned, right? It's just the time to bask in the victory lap that we won the Cold War, and that capitalism is going to solve all of life's problems, right? It's the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama had at one point said. And more to the point, the shock therapy model that was pressured onto all of these transitioning countries was the sooner you adapt free market capitalism, the better it will be. Now, again, no social safety nets, because the problem here is that safety nets produce taxes. They produce tariffs. They produce additional costs. International companies will find another place to set up shop. to open up their factories, to open up their stores, in countries that will promise cheaper labor and even greater profits. So these countries that, for decades were operating under a protected, planned economic system now have to compete with one another over who can be the lowest bidder in terms of getting a German, a British, an American, or a Japanese company to set up headquarters in one's own country. This is what we would call a race to the bottom. Thomas Friedman, who has never shied away from being one of the most vocal champions of free market fundamentalism, wrote in this book of his, The Lexus and the Olive Tree. I use this book for my class on globalization, about his so-called golden straitjacket theory, right? And this is basically the principles of neoliberalism, of shock therapy. Countries need to, debureaucratize their industries. They need to privatize all of their companies. They effectively need to open up, lay themselves bare to the free market, the global free market, and let the global corporations of the West take care of all of the nitty-gritty minutia, the day-to-day problems of the state. Because the more people are making money, the better the market exists in your country, the better the politics will get, right? This is the understanding of neoliberalism, is that a free market gives you a free political society. This has been written about extensively by Friedrich Hayek, by Milton Friedman, and a lot of these ideas are largely based on the premise of, dude, trust me on this, it's going to work. But it was adopted at face value by the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Washington Consensus, right? So this understanding here within shock therapy that, radical readjustment is necessary. And the more closed off your economy is, the more you will have to make those changes. You're going to have to accept short-term losses. That much is obvious. You're going to have to accept unemployment. Companies will be shut down. Companies that are seen as redundant will be, at best, stripped down to their, utilitarian bones. But the idea is that the faster you do this, and the more work you put into it, the sooner the long-term benefits are going to be, right? Think of it like this. You need to lose 30 pounds by the end of the month, right? Why? Just whatever reason. You need to lose 30 pounds. Now, there's lots of ways that you can lose 30 pounds in 1 month. Diet and exercise is certainly one way of doing it, but you will eventually lose those 30 pounds, maybe not in a month. There's other ways that you can do this, which involves cutting a lot of corners, starving oneself, torturous amounts of exercise and, workout regimens and whatever it is. Can you lose the 30 pounds in a month? Yes, absolutely. What will you look like at the end of those 30 months? Well, some of you might be chiseled. Others might look emaciated, right? The idea here is that neoliberalism at the time doesn't care. They just want to see the numbers. So if a country is able to come out of a 5-year, 7-year, 10-year period completely restructured towards the global free market, fantastic. Okay? The ends will justify the means. And yes, things like unemployment, corruption, and other elements are necessary evils, but they'll be dealt with. Well, the problem is this. The whole dude trust me assumption thinks that the end is going to somehow solve the immediate issues of corruption, bribery, patronage, and oligarchy. And the reality is that once those things set in, they rarely, if ever, go away. Countries that are going through these transitions are going to make a small segment of that population very, very rich. And if capitalism has taught us anything in the absence of abject fear of a mobile, angry working class, is that those that are exploiting others to make themselves rich are eventually going to realize they need to use their financial powers to secure political gains in order to disenfranchise and demobilize erstwhile angry people with pitchforks and torches. So by the end of the 90s, an incredibly rich, politically connected and security surveillance system immune class emerges. in all of these countries, the Baltics included. But this is why Russia in the 90s all of a sudden gives us the largest number of billionaires per capita, despite the fact that large segments of the population were now left by the wayside. And when it comes to far more authoritarian states of Central Asia, yes, about 2% of the population literally owns the other 95 to 98. So political patronage just becomes a self-reinforcing reality. Oligarchism becomes an internal self-reinforcing self-help system. Bribery becomes an evil reality where even ordinary people realize that I can get what I want, or better yet, I can get out of a worse situation if I just slip a couple of bills up someone's way. It still happens today. It still happens today. You get pulled over by the police for speeding in certain countries, and, the cops aren't going to necessarily imply it, but you just know, pay off the cop and he won't write you up. And is it bribery? Absolutely. Are you paying less in bribery than you would pay if you decided to go through the court system? Because you could say, oh, no, I'm going to go through the court system, justice will prevail. Well, you go in front of the judge is going to look at you and say, well, who the hell are you? I have no idea who you are. There's plenty of situations where a car can be pulled over for speeding, and all of a sudden, somebody walks out of the car and they end up being the most insufferable person out there. Not somebody that is politically connected. No, someone even worse. Somebody who is the child of someone who is politically connected. That whole, do you know who my father is question is enough to get any regular, ordinary cop that just needs to make a couple of extra bills on the side to make ends meet to say, oh, I'm sorry, move along. But if you walk out of the car and say, do you know who I am? The cop's going to say, no, I don't. So who are you trying to kid? So the shock therapy effectively created the internal security dilemma that reinforced the necessity of the security apparatus and these political oligarchs to entrench themselves in power, which explains a little bit more the reason for these hybrid regimes, right? Hybrid regimes are, in short, authoritarian-like governments that operate within and behind a thin facade of democracy. And they run the gamut, right? I mean, they can be little more than illiberal democracies with, some visible presence of a political opposition and some limited organized civil society within, let's say, the capital or the second city. Or they can range all the way to just simply competitive authoritarian states where, there are votes. There are a number of people that are paid to vote, but most people either realize that this is a little more than a charade and they stay home, or they just don't even bother altogether. But the major element of a hybrid regime is how a government, a group of people in power can monopolize said power through electoral means, right? This is the one thing that people realize very early on, is that in the olden days, authoritarian states existed in perpetuity through terror, fear, and complete hegemonic control. Post-Cold War, there's an easier way to do this. You can maintain your leverage on power simply through electoral legitimacy. All you got to do is play patronage to a certain percentage of the population that will turn out and loyally vote for you. Some of them do just because of kickbacks. Others do because the government actually favors you. You're somehow in the privileged neighborhood. You're the privileged ethnic group, the privileged religious group, whatever it, happens to be here. And at the end of the day, right, the elections may not necessarily be rigged, but they're definitely going to be manipulated. And the people in power turn around and say, well, what do you want? We had an election. This is the rule of the people, the rule of the majority. If you're upset about it, what are you, anti-democratic? It works within all kinds of propaganda ways, especially the media, right? You can have an independent media, no longer a state media, but surprise, surprise. The media is owned and operated by people that are loyal to the party. Sometimes by people that are directly related to the president or even a member of the president's family, right? So you've got the physical presence of political opposition within these countries. But the opposition is divided between what we would call loyal opposition, right, which gives the idea that there is some kind of political pluralism, although none of these other parties ever break rank with the ruling party. And then you've got that small group, it doesn't exist in all countries, but in some, that believe in the cause. They believe in the idea of a future of a liberal democratic state. But they end up being very small and atomistic. You know, they have very little presence outside of the first and second urban city. And they oftentimes tend to be followed by, students and, younger people. But if you check their Facebook accounts, you check their Twitter profiles, right, they got more friends and fans outside the country than they do in. So a lot of times the ruling government, the ruling party can look at these believe in the cause oppositions and say, they're fifth column elements, they're paid by NGOs, they take money from Soros, they're CIA operatives, this, that, the other thing, right? So in the meantime, right, hybrid regimes are those that promise democratic prosperity, but down the road, right? We got other things that we need to worry about. We have immediate problems, immediate threats to the state, whether it's in the form of, political or religious extremists, territory that is in the hands of a bunch of separatists, whatever it happens to be, right? The people in power constantly promise two things: order and stability. And they say this really for two reasons. A, it plays well to the older crowd. Right? The older crowd doesn't really care about any change. They're not progressives. You know what they want? They don't want taxes to go up. They don't want their wages to no longer be comparative or to be disproportionate to the cost of food and rent and housing and energy and other things, right? The pensioners are probably the most easy to buy off. All you need to do is either A, say, with us there is no uncertainty, which was actually a slogan used by the Serbian strongman Slobodan Milosevic in the 90s, or tried to keep as much of that Soviet-era, communist-era nostalgia as possible. Now, the second thing that goes into this promising order and stability is that these power brokers oftentimes have a very cozy relationship with the security apparatus of the state. And when it comes to the former Soviet Union, that means the closer you are to the head of your security detail that used to be an inner member of the KGB, the better. And more often than not, a lot of these security networks in one country work very well, work very nicely with others. So if you're able to get the backing of the security apparatus, then your position in power is, for the most part, assured. There might be some grumblings, there might be some protests, but nothing that will ever truly dislodge you from power. So you can play the democratic card by saying eventually, Rome wasn't built in a day. Not everything became democratic overnight. Some would even say, hey, look at the United States. It took them almost 200 years between getting rid of the British to finally referring to black people as, legitimate human beings in the civil rights era. So what are you expecting, Stan country? What are you expecting, Russia? What are you expecting, Georgia, Armenia, whatever, right? This is something that down the road is something to happen. But right now, we got other things to concern ourselves with. So that, necessitates an examination of this all-pervasive security state, which in the Hale article, right, the Soviet Union 25 years later, I think does an excellent job in bringing up, right? And this is the inconvenient truth that the one most important aspect of the Soviet Union that continued post-Soviet Union is the KGB-era security and surveillance networks, which took on new names and anagrams and symbols of their own, but for the most part continued to work together and still have some coordinated meeting in Moscow. So even to this day, here we are 30 years later, right? Some of the old-timer heads of the Interior Ministry, the security system, the surveillance state of most of these states are old enough to have gotten their start within the KGB. And when we get to Russia, I mean, Putin himself started out as a KGB operative, right? He's not a politician. So in this sense, it makes a lot of, it's a major understanding that your position is going to be secure by catering to your most loyal and important constituency, and that is the surveillance network, the security state, with the primary goal of securing one's borders, securing one's weapon stockpiles, and this is especially true in the 90s as Russia continued to fragment and experience territorial secessionism in the Caucasus, as well as social unrest amid rapid institutional change. Now, it's inevitable. There's going to be social unrest, and you don't want to, fire into the crowd. But what you at least want to do is make whatever public protests that happen innocuous. You want to localize them. You want to isolate them. You want to make it look like this is as good as it's going to get, right? And, in a way, I might as well bring this up now because some of you may be thinking, well, this sounds very similar to what happened in Russia about 2-3 weeks ago, right? If you remember, and here I am recording this July 11th, right? You remember that for about 12 to 18 hours, Russia was about to experience the first true uprising, mutiny, that it had experienced in years, when Yevgeny Prigozhin decided that he was going to drive all the way to Moscow. And, it kind of ended before it began. Within the first couple of hours, it became pretty clear that Prigozhin's erstwhile rebellion met with very few sympathizers. So he couldn't get really the one key element to back him, and that's the security apparatus. That's the FSB, which remains very much cooperating with Putin. So you kind of get this idea here that, there can be open challenges to the states, but as long as they remain isolated and controlled by the security apparatus, then there is no real threat to that state. Right? Now, within that time also, right, the security apparatus has a secondary goal, and that is providing a very clear, although non-vocal and indirect way of understanding how one gains access to power, privilege, and authority. In other words, you want to become rich, you want to become powerful, you want to become a head of state, you buy into the state. You effectively cooperate with the internal state apparatus. It's just that simple, right? It is just that simple in that regard. And so the security sector of many of these countries, right, guarantees the authority in perpetuity of a group of nameless, faceless, and unaccountable individuals that secretly run the country behind the scenes, right? So, the one thing that came to mind when I was looking at how the events quickly developed and evaporated 2-3 weeks ago with Prigozhin, is that in order to understand Russia, which, Prigozhin is almost there in Moscow, and we're wondering, is there going to be a shootout? There's no way that he's going to succeed, but this could result in at least a couple of days of some kind of military confrontation. And all of a sudden, Prigozhin gets a phone call from Belarus's President Lukashenko, who says he is speaking on behalf of Putin. They have a conversation for about a half an hour, and then suddenly Prigozhin stops. Like we're getting bits and pieces of the transcript that was, that came out of that conversation. I would really, really, really love to hear, what was going on. But it's interesting in the sense that, Putin didn't even break a sweat. People in the West, people in Ukraine were thinking, that's it. Russia's gone. It's our ace in the hole type of thing. And others were like, no, this is not how it works. There's a reason why Russia operates the way that it does. And so what I'm trying to say here with all of this is that by noting the omnipresence of the security apparatus, one can then look at countries like Russia, or Belarus, or Uzbekistan, or others, not as modern parliamentary or presidential democracies, but as mafia states, but as mini empires. And I don't say that pejoratively, right? I'm not even trying to be, sleight of tongue here. I'm trying to say that, there is the same way in which organized crime operates through a security system. It's the exact same way that we see Russia, Belarus, among others, operate, right? Is that the people that truly control the state are the ones that are operating behind the scenes. And if you as president or, to a lesser degree, prime minister, have the backing and the support of these people, then your position in power is largely secure, right? In Russia, there's even a term for these people. They're called the siloviki, right? And we don't know how many comprise the siloviki. We don't know exactly who are members of the siloviki, right? But these are really the jugglers behind the scenes that run the show. It's like, the Mafia running Vegas in the 70s and the 80s. So, if there are elections in these countries, and many of them do take place, they are monitored and regulated in favor of the network-approved candidates. Right? I'll give you one more example before we move on. Previously I had mentioned that in the last 6 to 7 years, Uzbekistan has experienced a 180-degree turnaround from the closed-off authoritarian rule of Islam Karimov. Right, the new president, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, is almost the exact opposite of his predecessor. But Mirziyoyev got to where he was at the time by being a very close supporter of Karimov, right? He was part of Karimov's inner political circle. He was a member of that last generation of Uzbek Soviet communists that sort of continued on in the post-Soviet period and rose through the ranks by being the most, I would say, acceptable successor to the presidency. I mean, look, that's not to question or diminish his qualifications, but, technically speaking, according to the Uzbek constitution, when Karimov died in office in 2016, he was supposed to have been succeeded by the chairman of the Senate, a man by the name of Nigmatilla Yuldashev. Mirziyoyev was prime minister, but according to the official story, right, Yuldashev had deferred to Mirziyoyev, thinking that he was much more qualified for the role. That may very well have been the case, but we also cannot discount the idea that for about 2 to 3 days after Karimov had died, there was great uncertainty in the country over who would succeed him and whether there would be a couple of moves to seize power by one or two factions, one of which was actually coming from Karimov's own family. The true kingmaker behind the scenes, and the one that most people regard run the country, even today he's in his 80s and he has officially retired, but he still wields a significant amount of influence, is a man by the name of Rustam Inoyatov, who was the head of the Uzbek Secret Service, the Uzbek Secret Police, who prior to that, he's an old KGB operative. And it was Inoyatov's decision to go with Mirziyoyev as the designated successor, which is all the more obvious when shortly after Mirziyoyev was appointed president, Vladimir Putin comes to Tashkent to pay a visit, and the first person that Putin sees is Inoyatov, and then Mirziyoyev, right? Almost to the sense of showing, okay, I'm seeing the real power behind the throne before I meet the actual throne itself. Again, this is not to question, right, the leadership and the decision-making of Mirziyoyev, but it is the idea, right, that being in the right place and having all the right connections gets you into power, right? That's your major qualification. And look, a large part of this, whether it's Uzbekistan or Tajikistan or Russia or Azerbaijan or whoever it happens to be, this is all done in the name of preventing threats to state security from either external groups, which could range from everything including NATO, the EU, the US, the CIA, whoever, Al-Qaeda, whatever, and worse, internal contagion from political radicals. Now, one thing that I need to kind of take a pause here and note is that many areas of the former Soviet Union throughout the 90s did experience, right, internal threats to state security. Russia with a restless Chechnya. Tajikistan had a civil war, and there was at least one major uprising in Uzbekistan in the Fergana Valley. So in all of these cases, whether they were deliberately trumped up to show the power of the state, or whether they were legitimate challenges to the proverbial throne, the security apparatus exists to put these things down. Right? At the end of the day, the security apparatus isn't so much interested in perpetuating authoritarianism as it wants stability and quiet. And if they have a say in appointing who the new leaders will be, chances are the horse that they back already has a significant amount of leverage than every other competitor, right? So the idea of the security state existing to possess last-minute authority, right? They don't act, pervasively in everyday life, but they're there behind the scenes. And they are given the idea, or people have the idea, that the security apparatus has the force necessary to use against citizens or others or anyone or anything who are considered to be dangerous to the state. So once again, if you are a politician that secures a good working relationship with the security apparatus, you effectively become the kingmaker and the power broker, which explains the long-term legitimacy and authority of people like Putin, Lukashenko, Nazarbayev, Rahmon in Tajikistan, Niyazov in Turkmenistan, and Edward Shevardnadze in Georgia. Right before Shevardnadze lost power, he effectively was power. And this is another interesting thing here, is that just because you get the backing of the security state today doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have it in perpetuity. So what then is the recipe that keeps one in power? Why is it that some people have been able to run their respective countries, not in years, but in decades, and others just kind of come and go, and for a brief moment, they make their name known before they become, forgotten oddities? I'm still sticking with the Henry Hale article here, and one very important aspect of this piece argues the importance of patronalism. Right? Patronalism is a term that he used. It's patrimonialism, clientelism, networking, whatever synonym that you want to use. But it's basically understood. Patronalism is understood to be a social equilibrium in which individuals organize their political and economic pursuits primarily around the personalized exchange of concrete rewards and punishments, instead of abstract principles or ideologies. Now, that's a nice academic way to say personal connections are always going to get you further over personal convictions, right? If you have convictions, but you've got the connections, fantastic. If you believe in the cause, but you don't know anybody, lots of luck, right? If you're lucky, you might be able to get a political party small enough to get some, petty cash funding from the Open Society Foundation. But, look, in all seriousness here, the notion of patronalism is really one of two things, right? One, it is the idea that it is not so much what you can do and what you're qualified for as to who you know, right? So it's personal connections get you places. Hence the idea that what I said before, you got to look at a lot of these countries less as, let's say, modern parliamentary systems and more as patronage networks, the way in which organized criminal syndicates run. Right? That's not to say that they are mafia states, but yeah, they kind of operate along that structure, right? You know the right people, you pay patronage to certain people above you, they protect you. Now, this obviously and incontrovertibly leads to, right, the inevitable entrenchment of corruption, right? This is just one of the, the expected side effects of all of this. Now, corruption is one of those things where, if you're, again, a true dyed-in-the-wool, idealistic, democratic NGO, you're going to want to stamp out corruption everywhere and anywhere that you see. Now, look, let's be perfectly honest here. I mean, there are very few countries in the world today that are basically corruption-free. And, these are largely smaller, peripheral, little squeaky clean Scandinavian countries, which, like Denmark or Iceland, which, at that point, is it really corruption so much, or is it just, the political apparatus? But when we talk about, transitioning countries from single party authoritarian rule, corruption almost becomes the way in which things get done. And, again, a rather inconvenient reality to note here is that sometimes corruption just makes things run faster, just runs, much more smoothly. So, there's different levels of corruption for different reasons. There's high-level corruption for elites. There's low-level corruption for, ordinary citizens. High-level corruption is, full-on embezzling, tax evasion. Sometimes we can get, I wouldn't even say high-level, I would just say careless corruption, where, elections are ultimately rigged or political opponents are eliminated. But, everyday corruption is something that ordinary citizens not only accept, but somehow depend on, right? So, let's say the bribery network. I said beforehand, it's oftentimes cheaper to just simply pay off a cop than to go through the court systems and try to challenge the speeding ticket or the parking ticket. There's also high levels of cases, not just in the former Soviet Union, but in much of the developing world, where, you get sick and you need to go see a doctor. Yeah, you've got your state clinics, but you also have your private doctors. Those are, out of pocket. There's nothing underhanded about that, right? That's all above board. But let's say you have to spend some time in the hospital. It's never written, but it's just generally implied that if you or, if you're in the hospital, or better yet, a family member is in the hospital, you kind of want to bring, some flowers and some chocolates and, maybe a few, euros or dollar bills in an envelope. Not to cheer up your family member that's a patient there, but to give them to the nurses or to the doctors. You give flowers not to the patient, but to the nurses. You give chocolates to the nurses, simply because you just want to tip them and say, look, I know that you're not paid all that well. And let's be honest here, in many cases, corruption, kickbacks, briberies oftentimes provides complementary incomes to wages that are way below one's qualification. So it's a way of keeping people from effectively taking their profession and going elsewhere to do that, whether you're doctors, nurses, professional, labor, whatever it happens to be. And the other understanding is that if you don't give certain chocolates or candies or little things, it's not that your family relative is going to be mistreated, but they're just not going to get that extra little TLC that you would get if you gave them a few, chocolate bonbons. And with the doctors, it's the same thing. This technically is all under the table. Technically speaking, this is illegal. But realistically speaking, this is just how things are done, right? Just having a wad of dollars or euros or rubles or whatever in your pocket just can solve really a lot of issues. And so when this becomes not the exception, but the rule, it no longer is seen as corruption, right? It's just simply seen as how things go. And there's always some kind of kickback one way or the other. So you bribe someone here, people owe you a favor there, you've got connections here, you've got a favor to call in there, you're in good here. It's basically, it's a patronage network, right? It's a patronage network. So this whole notion of patronalism is more than just simply a bunch of political elites safeguarding the office supply closet to ensure that only they steal from the office supply closet. But look, everybody in their own socioeconomic station has got an office supply closet to steal from, a trough to feed from. And, every so often, you're going to get these political movements that, again, believe in the cause and want to clean up the town by eliminating the whole corruption network. And unfortunately, right, even though this sounds like a fantastic idea, right, unfortunately, statistical evidence has shown that attempts at trying to clean up the system either, at best, replaces the old people stealing with new people stealing, and at worst, ends up getting you killed. Because there are a lot of people that rely on kickbacks, sort of here or there. So, oftentimes the literature, whether it's in academic material or in journalism, will look at many of these countries and just simply dismiss them as helpless and hopeless because, everything operates on bribery, connections, nepotism, sort of this, that, the other thing. What's interesting is that the very same individuals, again, whether they're in the academic or the policy world, are going to champion a few white horses. They're going to champion a few heroes here or there that kind of challenge the system, but forget that if these people actually get into power, they end up just becoming the new system, right? So it's very rare. It is very, very, very rare that true reformers not only come to power, but change around the network. If it happens, it's very slow and it's very, very, very gradual. And again, only with the tacit approval of the security network. But if we were to just simply look at two individuals, Mikhail Saakashvili, who for a brief period was the president of Georgia, and kind of like the little white knight, the little knight in shining plastic wrap that the West had propped up as a bulwark of democracy against the entrenched Russian Soviet bureaucracy. Okay, a couple of things. Saakashvili is now widely a disgraced politician. Once he comes to power, he doesn't become really a democratic reformist so much as a narcissistic Bonapartist. So it's very common that you end up becoming part of that system. And if you can't be bought, or if you have no place in that system, you just end up being removed by that system. And one of the best examples of this is Rosa Otunbayeva, who for a brief moment was the interim president of Kyrgyzstan, Central Asia's only female head of state, one that is widely regarded as legitimate and popular among the people, but again, comes from a privileged political background, right? So she's not somebody that came from the streets and assembled her way to power, right? She does come from previous connections. Again, nothing against her, right? Nothing against her, but that already provides a certain comparative advantage. And knowing her convictions and her belief in trying to transform Kyrgyzstan into a functioning democracy, better yet, a parliamentary democracy, the powers that be behind the scenes did a couple of things to somehow, look at that, prevent her, disqualify her from running for president. Right? And it's a hell of a lot easier to just simply say, you failed to meet certain specifications and you just failed by paperwork than being physically prevented from doing so. Otunbayeva's presence within Kyrgyz politics kind of came and went about a decade ago. She is still around today, but she largely is outside of the political spheres, of that country. So bearing in mind all of this, the all-pervasive security apparatus, the pressures from external forces to economically reform in the name of free market fundamentalism, which leads to all kinds of socioeconomic inequalities, and the presence of some gray-zoned hybrid regime in which there's just enough rhetorical democracy to make the CNN headlines look the other way, in favor of a regime and a political apparatus that just simply uses and abuses and cheats its way into power. It's not a surprise that there is a weak civil society, right? We understand civil society to, in so many words, be a group of consciously minded citizens that aren't just actively involved in local affairs, but feel empowered, right? Feel empowered that they can actually organize, voice their opinions, and influence government, right? That's the whole notion of civil society being the voice of the people that tells political society what they want. At absolute best, right? At absolute best, civil society can organize itself into mass collective protest. But other than that, there's very little that civil society can do to change the course of government, which leads to ultimately what we in the discipline acknowledge as a culture of disappointment, right? As sort of this understanding among, the average citizen that this is as good as it's going to get. Don't expect things to get any better anytime soon unless it benefits the people in power. Why bother? Don't get yourself all emotionally wrapped up in these things. You've got really three options. You can either, buy yourself into the state and therefore get all the perks of living here. B, you can just kind of forget everything and just try to make as good a life for you and your family as possible. Or C, right? Or C, you pack up and move away. You go someplace else, right? And if you want to raise your family, you want to raise your kids someplace else, that's it. You're not waiting for the reforms to come here. You literally go to where the wanted reforms happen to exist, right? This, sort of helps us understand that while there are growing and legitimate grievances, legitimate concerns against the states by a number of people, right, as I've said, there's little opportunity for any real political organization. And, while this seems kind of obvious right now, this is also something that is generally overlooked, at least in early assessments of how these newly emerging post-communist states were doing in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s, right? When people are asking, well, why isn't there any credible opposition? Why doesn't public protest do apparently what they did in 1989? How come we don't see the same amount of social revolutions that toppled regimes years ago? What's wrong with these people? This, of course, does two things. One, I think it over-exaggerates what 1989 to 1991 actually did. I think more so, public protest just simply called out an aging and teetering bureaucratic authoritarian apparatus that really, was just, a couple of years away from institutional collapse. But B, it also assumes that public protests alone will change the course of politics. And, when we factor all of this stuff into an emerging market economy within these countries, and B, countries that are governed by regimes that use some form of electoral legitimacy to stay in power, it is amazing how much public protest can be visible, but go little beyond that, right? And in many situations, when we think about hybrid regimes, especially those that are secure enough by the security sector to weather the storm, they actually encourage public protest, right? They encourage gatherings and opposition because they can do one of two things, right? A, they can point to this in the press and say, you see, this is a great example of the idea that we allow people to voice their freedom of expression, right? We give them the freedom to voice their opinions, to voice their speeches, right? And as long as they are, institutionally and organizationally innocuous, you can kind of get away with that, right? And the second one, right, the second thing is that this can oftentimes be co-opted by the regime, right? Public protests can be allowed if they can be exploited. In which case, either A, you listen to the grievances of the public and then decide to act on them, and some regimes just simply wait for the public to get really, really, really upset before they do something, so then they can turn around in the press and say, we finally met the cries and the woes of the people, right? Aren't we benevolent? Or two, you can let some elements of protest become more extreme and more hardline than others, and then watch and wait for the opposition movements to start infighting with each other over, how to conduct the protest, who is the designated spokesperson. And then if you are the regime waiting for internal decay within all of this, you can kind of point out the hardliners in all of this and say, these are the guys that want to overthrow the state rather than reforming it, divide and conquer. Now, that's not to say that protests have no effect on the political apparatus, right? Protests can certainly challenge the state if the entrenched authorities fail to enact proper socioeconomic reform or are perceived to profit at the direct expense of the people. So within the literature on hybrid regimes and competitive authoritarian states and, all of those little, gray area governments, there are enough examples where, people in power think that they are somehow immune from everything, but eventually overplay their hand. And, this usually comes around when, let's say, elections are clearly fraudulent, where even some regime supporters wince at the amount of ballot stuffing and electoral manipulation. Another one is when the old guard of the regime seems to be pretty much heading towards retirement. And instead of opening up the ballot for true, democratic competition, it's sort of like the old guard may be given some kind of leeway, some kind of acceptance from the public that, reform is not going to come with them. And so we're just going to have to wait for the old man, whether it's, Rahman in Tajikistan, Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, Lukashenko in Belarus, Putin in, you get the idea, whoever it happens to be, right? We kind of wait for their term limits to expire, and then, according to the Constitution, they step down. Either A, they decide to change around the Constitution to extend their term limits, B, heir their authority and legacy to one of their children. And you'd be surprised how often this is attempted. Whatever these things happen to be, there's always one move that the regime risks overplaying, right? They risk taking too much of a step. And that's enough to spark some kind of response from the people. Usually, the people are at a point where they can't take it anymore. They've had enough, right? Their patience has largely run out. But here's the thing where, disappointment just continues, in the sense that protests can happen, but as I've already mentioned, without organization and leadership, these protests ultimately fail as revolutions. And even if the old regime is somehow dislodged from power, new leaders that come in, new parties, whatever, regardless of what they say that they are in front of the cameras, they ultimately end up being just like the old regime, especially when somebody realizes in the crowd that, their current champion of the political opposition, kind of rode the coattails of being sort of like, the assistant regional manager of the regime that they are currently fighting against, right? So, a lot of these protests are united really only in one thing, right? This collective opposition to the regime, right? Everybody has come to the conclusion that the current people have to go. But what they want in return is something completely different, right? Some want honest democracy. Others want, another political party just as, nepotistic to come to the fore. Others want, sweeping radical change, but, in the form of radical ideology or religion or something like that, right? And, others just simply protest because they just like to watch large parts of the state burn down, okay? In most situations, especially in hybrid regimes where opposition is at best, minimal, they really only have exposure to, let's say, a certain percentage of the youth in the capital city, the opposition parties are already limited in strength and appeal, right? You need to get like wide-scale public acceptance, support for one opposition movement and, a charismatic leader in that sense. And, after years of, sort of adapting to the realities of, survival of the fittest, everything is ultimately driven by, the dollar more than anything else. There's no sense of idealism. The whole country operates on, corruption and, patronalism. Those that, truly take to the streets because they are fed up, like the students, are generally apolitical in nature. They have, some idea of what democracy is or what it should be, but They don't trust any of the existing political parties because they see them all as, different shades, of corruption. So, for the most part, they're really good at, strikes and walkouts of universities and, holding up signs which are, written in the best English possible. These are the ones that, make the headlines of CNN and BBC and all the other Western media. You're also going to get, some dissidents, some, let's say, ideological dissidents from, intellectuals and other civic groups. But, for the most part, they are grassroots movements that, like students, are more atomized than they are inclusive. This is another thing that I think gets taken too much seriously here, and that is, the amount of NGOs, the amount of Western-backed NGOs that exist in, many of these countries. And here I'm, bringing up Eastern Europe, the Balkans, everything else like that, like Bosnia, for instance. I think that there's like an NGO for every 3 people in the country. And it's a great way for policymakers, academics, and other political, bobbleheads on Twitter to feel important. I'm part of an NGO, I'm making a difference. Where to the, the average person in the country, if they even know who they are, they would simply say, no, you're not. You're really not doing anything. I mean, you're doing this really to feel good about yourself and, to get the Twitter reposts and the Twitter likes. So, the grassroots dissidence is there. But, outside of, key urban intellectual circles, they're relatively unknown and, widely useless. Now, here's where things get interesting, because if there is enough visible sign of disenchantment with a current government that the protests grow and become daily and are, hard to miss, and eventually it gets picked up by what I call the CNN effect, right? All of a sudden, this starts making international headlines, and without, the benefit of knowing all of the things that led up to this protest, we suddenly are alerted to something that's happening in some, godforsaken post-communist, post-Soviet republic in the middle of nowhere, where the public just simply wants democracy. They want reform. And, into the fray comes a whole bunch of, Western-backed, funding and additional NGOs and support from the EU or NATO or the United States or the State Department or or Downing Street or, Paris or Berlin or something like that, right? And, there's always pet projects to fund, especially in countries where, you would maybe like to further advance your diplomatic foothold in the country, especially if the country is sort of trying to lurch itself away from Moscow. So a lot of these opposition movements end up getting simultaneously blessed and cursed by international support. And I say blessed in the sense that they now are given attention and they're given funding, and sometimes they're given a platform with which to voice their grievances, voice their views. Of course, this automatically targets them as fifth column elements, traitors, people that will sell their country out to the CIA or the FBI or the White House or, George Soros, Jeff Bezos, whoever it happens to be, right? And this, of course, leads to their stigmatization within the, the pro-government media. Now, we need to understand, right, that for all the people that might be organizing in a public protest in the capital city and maybe 1 or 2 other major urban centers, the rest of the country remains basically passive. Right? The rest of the country is neither out there supporting the regime, nor are they supporting the opposition movements. Right? For them, they're just trying to stay alive. They're just trying to go about their own thing. But all of this kind of, and for years I've been thinking about this. Right? All of this reminds me that y'all need to reread your Lenin. This is one of the problems with many of these post-communist countries, is that they go in and change the Soviet era curriculum, and all of a sudden nobody's reading State and Revolution anymore. And, if there's one thing that differentiates Lenin from Marx, is that, Marx was the ideologue, he was the political economist, Lenin was the activist. Lenin is the one that says, look, the discontentment among the proletarian is one thing. organized revolution is something else. And you can't just simply, stand out there with placards and colored flags and all sorts of things and expect that the government is going to completely capitulate, right? You have to storm the Winter Palace. You have to effectively, blow something up, set things on fire. You need to kind of, create a little chaos. And in this regard, a lot of these color revolutions that, we like to think of in a positive sense, really fail before they get to stage two. Now, we call them color revolutions because, since Georgia, the opposition movements, in a way of showing solidarity among everybody opposed to the regime, kind of adopts a particular color. Whether it's rose for Georgia, orange for Ukraine. The tulip revolution was characterized for Kyrgyzstan, the cedar revolution for Lebanon, the green revolution, that one failed even before it really began, the jasmine revolution in Tunisia, the lotus revolution in Egypt. The only one that isn't given a color is the first one that we can classify with this, and that's the bulldozer revolution, the one in Serbia that toppled the Milosevic government. And we call it the bulldozer revolution because a couple of Serbian farmers literally drove their bulldozers, drove their tractors into the center of Belgrade. And I think one of them drove the tractor up the steps of Parliament and, knocked the Parliament doors down so people could, move on in. If I'm not mistaken, that bulldozer is in some museum right now, right? But it's interesting to point out how, one revolution after another kind of takes the same procedural steps, right? A lot of them have nonviolent characteristics to them, which, look, in itself is fine. Nonviolent revolutions certainly prevents violence, prevents casualties. That much is certain. But again, it really is sort of it really is a post-authoritarian form of public discontentment in which grievances, which are, as I said, very much legitimate, right? Very much well placed, for the most part, go really little further than newspaper headlines and hashtags. And that's the reason why we oftentimes regard these things as rotten transitions, right? And, the limits of all of this is, as I've already mentioned, if they are successful, and, the three that did succeed in changing government leadership in the former Soviet Union. Georgia in 2003, Ukraine in 2004, and again in 2014, and Kyrgyzstan in 2005, and again in 2010. All three of them, if they have one thing that succeeds, is that they succeed in transitioning the leadership, but they fail in transforming the system of government. So you're really just ousting the head of state, right, by rival officials that either worked for the entrenched regime that was just ousted, or might be political outsiders, but the apparatus of the state that favors patronalism, and in some more than enough cases, still has to defer to that hidden security system, does little more than just simply change names, right, and maybe party logos. Right. So, for instance, in Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, who was regarded as one of the major political leaders of the Rose Revolution in 2003, he started by working with the government of Eduard Shevardnadze. So you don't get that far without being part of the old gravy train. It's at one point where you either A, are kicked out of the gravy train posse, or B, feel like you want to move up the trough, right? You want more. So in Saakashvili's case, right, Shevardnadze government is overthrown in 2003. Shevardnadze goes into political retirement. But very quickly, Saakashvili becomes just as much of an authoritarian figurehead as Shevardnadze. In fact, even more to the point, he's regarded as almost a full-on Bonapartist, right, who considers that he has this mandate to change the nature of the state by his own will. And because he had gotten support from the West, right, the United States, the EU, the UK, look at him and see him as an ally that can be useful in changing the trajectory of Georgia away from Russia and towards Europe, towards the European Union, perhaps even NATO. Well, this automatically just, sends out sirens and signals to Moscow. But it also gives people like Saakashvili and Petro Poroshenko, right, this sense that they can do whatever they want. Because even if they are regarded as, autocrats by their own people, they can dismiss this by saying, well, criticism is just simply coming from the pro-Russian camp. And it's amazing. It is absolutely amazing, ladies and gentlemen, how much that is used as a default fail-safe, right? In this day and age, when it comes to pro-Western liberal democratic governments or pro-Western governments that want to be liberal Democrat, they'll just simply say anybody that disagrees with me is a paid stooge from Russia, right? It happens in the United States, all the time. Poroshenko is one who, comes to power in the second Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Euromaidan movement, the one that most people know about, in 2014. And, very quickly asserts himself as the president that is going to realign Ukraine away from Russia towards the West. Ukraine has a future in the EU. It's got a future in NATO and, all that good stuff, right? All that good stuff. No negotiations with Putin, especially after the seizure of Crimea. And at the time, military presence in the Donbas region. Poroshenko was part of the Yanukovych clan beforehand. Unless you are, somebody who only pays attention to these countries when CNN tells you to do so, you're going to look at these people and see them less as democratic revolutionaries and just more as, political opportunists. And, this is, doubly apparent when these individuals, as well as other more official political opposition movements, really fail to connect public protest with true civic activism, right? So another, example, and here I am now focusing on the last two articles on for this week. So the Theodore Todorio article on colored revolutions, and then the Polese and Obajuan ones. And that is, civil society may be nascent, right? It may not go beyond, let's say, the urban intellectuals, but the political opportunists see no use in working with them, right? That's the other thing, is that there already is internal divisions within the political opposition, beyond just simply collective protest against the old regime. So these opportunists think that they can just simply come to power and rule by decree. And if they're going to get, carte blanche support and immunity, diplomatic immunity from Washington or Brussels or Paris or Berlin or London, well, again, they do so at their own risk. Mind you, I need to mention this, that both Saakashvili and Poroshenko, so they sort of came in as these champions of Western reform, and both of them were decisively voted out of office. Poroshenko lost horribly in the 2019 elections to Volodymyr Zelensky. I mean, Zelensky comes in on like a 75% voter turnout. So Poroshenko's popularity just quickly plummeted. Most people just saw him as, little more than, a pro-Western kleptocrat. The only thing that separated him from his predecessor, Viktor Yanukovych, is that Yanukovych was a puppet of Moscow, whereas Poroshenko was a puppet of the United States. And, if you're kind of thinking to yourself now, that sounds a lot like Zelensky, it kind of also says that someone like Zelensky, we'll get to this when we get to Ukraine, you can come in as an outsider simply because, political society is so fragmented in Ukraine. But if you honestly think that you can do what you want that you promised in your campaign, the security apparatus and the embedded structures of the states that have just solidified over the past 25 or so years is going to tell you otherwise. So you either conform to what was beforehand, or you risk just simply being thrown out of power. Okay. Now, in one way, yes, we can blame the political opposition for failing to connect with civic activism, but at the same time, right, there's a lot of these civic activist groups that are advocating for things that are just not feasible for these countries, right? At least not yet, right? At least not in the foreseeable future. And that's kind of the nice, neat, simplistic thing about being part of a Western-backed NGO in the former communist East, is that you can stick to your principles as long as you are in your little swanky, apartment suite, typing out blogs and sharing tweets that, have no connection with the rest of society. And, if you're funded by Soros or USAID or, any of these other pro-Western groups, and, you really have no other interest beyond a couple of articles that you publish a year, during the year, or better yet, you go visit some academic conference where you're, legitimately believed to be famous or important, well, then what do you care, right? You're absolutely okay with that. So the thing is that most of civil society is largely ignored beyond the physical presence of protesting in the public square. If the previous government, is removed and replaced by these new incumbent quote-unquote reformers, right? They're usually, you can tell, within a 3 to 6 month period if they are true to their word or whether they truly just are people that want to have their own share at feeding from the trough. So reforms, these promised reforms, usually target only elements of the old regime while entrenching the interests and the powers of the current leadership, as well as their clients. So reforms don't get rid of the system of corruption. They just get rid of the people that were benefiting from it. And you can, of course, arrest them. They're highly unpopular. You can get the anger of the public wanting to, have the judge throw the book at some of these people. And yeah, you can strip them of their wealth. You can disgrace them, on the 6 o'clock news. And you can basically say, look, your only saving grace is to go into exile. And yeah, that's going to win you certainly some accolades in the first month or so. But as I said, if all that you do is get rid of one group of kleptocrats because you now want to raid the office supply closet, as well as your own clients, well, then we're just simply switching chairs, right? We're just not even switching chairs. We're just switching upholstery on the same damn chair, right? And so, look, eventually what's going to happen is that any noticeable failure in enacting improvements, significant improvements in socio-political life is within a year going to just deepen public dissatisfaction and further weaken social capital, right? Like you might get people that are enthusiastic about these movements, once, where people are like genuinely with it, they're optimistic, they truly believe that we have turned a corner, right? But if after a year it's the same old stuff, in fact, it gets even more problematic, right? The cost of living continues to rise. Wages continue to be stagnant. But this time, the kleptocrats are, instead of waving little Russian flags, they're waving EU flags, and they're doing everything possible to ingratiate themselves with European and American leaders. Well, then, at some point, the general man in the streets is simply going to say, fuck it. Why bother? And once you get to that, the regime loves it because the more disengaged, disillusioned people are, the more likely that these people will continue to remain in power, right? So, ultimately opposition just becomes a little more than repetitive palace coups. Sometimes if you have two of these colored revolutions at one point, you're in the street chanting down with the regime next to a political opportunist that you might look and say, hey, weren't you the guy that we overthrew in the previous color revolution? Funny that, right? And, absurdism just, wins the day here, right? So, you can kind of notice how these things happen, right? You can kind of what makes it a colored revolution when you see it. As I mentioned, there usually is one moment in which the entrenched government overplays its hand. They get a little cocky. They steal too much from the trough. They kind of get a little bit too big for their own ego. Or more to the point, you got a newer generation of these cadres that just completely act psychopathically spoiled. Whatever they happen to be, right? Especially fraudulent national elections where people know that their votes were stolen, or polling stations were closed, or just the ballot boxes were just openly stuffed. This is enough to get people out into the street. There's one kind of neat thing is that people may be apathetic throughout most of the year, but they do get angry when their votes aren't taken seriously. So when the opposition begins to protest against election fraud, right, the incumbent regime has got, a couple of last remaining options available. You could call in, the OSCE and have, or other electoral outside monitors just to make certain that, everything is, above par. Or you just simply cast your fate and just say that the security apparatus is going to keep them in power. If it looks like they really have no institutional fallback, this is where public protest begins to grow. And it usually happens, among the younger generations, right? The students. They have nothing to lose. They truly believe in the ideology of democracy. Their brains are full of over-the-top optimistic assessments of the world from political science classes and lectures like this or something like that, right? But these students begin to organize open resistance against the status quo, but they remain apolitical. They're just simply sick and tired of everything. And, if the country, is connected to social media, which oftentimes it is, a lot of these student grievances will be voiced, whether it's on Facebook or YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, whatever have you. And it spreads pretty quickly, right? It spreads quickly, especially when it gives people an opportunity to know that there's strength in numbers against an incredibly unpopular, corrupt, and inept regime. Now, if there is enough collective opposition to force the government out of power, right? And a lot of times they realize, the game is up. If they got one final option to play when all other options have been exhausted, and that is hope that you still remember your password to your Swiss bank account, make sure that the plane is gassed up, and get out of Dodge as quickly as possible, right? So the removal of this regime creates this new caretaker government, right? This new revolutionary government that sometimes they call for new elections, and other times they just simply assume power, right? They just simply come into power thinking that they were already elected. There's no need for another one. And more often than not, unfortunately, this new revolutionary government over time displays the same types of regressive policies that are similar, if some cases even worse, than the old regime. So, the Saakashvili government that had replaced Shevardnadze ends up becoming more corrupt, more egotistical, and even more power hungry. In Kyrgyzstan, and here I would say Kyrgyzstan was less of an internationally backed revolution because most people didn't even know what was going on in Kyrgyzstan. So that's one thing going for it, but it largely failed before it even began because the Tulip Revolution had very little to no civil society. I mean, we're talking about a country in Central Asia here, and that's not to stereotype the country. But, the student movements in Bishkek were small, atomistic. They certainly had heard about what had happened in Serbia and Georgia, but most of the students were more interested in just, studying, getting their degrees, getting out of the country as much as possible, and in their spare time just smoking and drinking beer. So, the biggest proponents of the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan were political rivals to the Akayev government. So in this sense, we're really talking about regional warlordism. And that's also because Kyrgyzstan is not as centralized as the other states happen to be. It's very mountainous. It's difficult to get from one part of the country to the other while staying in that country. Sometimes it's easier to leave the country, go to another country, and then go back to that country because of all the mountains that you have. And then when we get to Ukraine, At the end of the day, political opposition is nothing more than a bunch of opportunists and power-hungry egomaniacs. I mean, this is how it's been since day one. Whether it's Poroshenko or Timoshenko or Yushchenko or, Kuchma or Kravchuk or, any of these people, they got their own little political loyalists, and it is a patronage system, so everybody is expecting to feed from the trough. And, it's kind of like in a Game of Thrones episode where, one episode you're fighting this other family, this other faction. And then a couple of episodes later, some new faction comes in and you go to the one that you were previously fighting and saying, hey, it's just all business, nothing personal, right? And then you form coalitions and agreements with previous people that you thought were the devil incarnate. If we're talking here about any real structural change that revolutions do, right? A revolution is really meant to completely change the way in which people do things, people solve problems, people think. And in all three of these cases, protest politics just simply removes the current corrupt regime in office and just replaces it with another. So, the bureaucracy remains, corruption remains, nepotism remains. I mean, I know I'm repeating myself here, but, I'm hoping to get the point across. And, not a surprise that there is increasing disillusionment among the population because there's really no major democratic development, right? It's the people that, the people in power use and abuse the people's plights simply to get into power. And then what they do, they use all of their money, wealth, and power to buy dachas and drive Mercedes and, summer homes in Crimea or Turkey, or, have an apartment that the kids can go to in London or Berlin or Munich or, or what have you. Okay? So, why is it then that these colored revolutions produce rotten transitions? Well, as I've already mentioned here, we've got the nature of protest versus the versatility of the opposition. Now, you can be united in protest, but if you're disjointed in vision, again, Lenin wrote about this stuff a century ago. And even when there are some discernible united student movements, and the biggest one is in Serbia. I know that this class focuses on the former Soviet Union, but it's worth bringing up Serbia right now. The student resistance movement Otpor, which was formed in the last years of the 1990s. I'd say roughly around like 97 to the big, protest movements in 2000. During that time, they were widely popular, and they were seen as a great example of how organized socio-political ideals in Serbia can provide an alternative view of the country, which at the time was heavily, horribly stigmatized by Western press in the 90s as being just awash in xenophobic nationalism, historical revisionism, this, that, the other thing. The problem with Otpor is not that it took a lot of money from the West. A lot of people knew that. And at the time, some of its leaders, including one of the heads of Otpor, Srđa Popović, right, when constantly questioned, you're taking money from Soros, you're taking money from the West, his response was, look, I'll take money from anybody. I'll take money from Russia if need be. The money basically goes to fund the movement. And if the movement has has an ideal goal, well, then this is not Soros, this is us doing this. The problem is this. When Milosevic was removed from power, Otpor basically disintegrated. So this would have been the opportunity for Otpor to now enter politics. Again, folks, y'all need to read your Lenin. It's not enough to simply get rid of the Romanovs. You got a state now that you have inherited. So Otpor could have been a perfect political movement to represent, right, the 20-somethings of the country. But instead, Otpor decides to franchise out its protest strategy to Georgia, to Kyrgyzstan, to Egypt, to Lebanon, to Tunisia, and others. I actually am Facebook friends with Popović. He hasn't posted anything recently. Maybe it's because I defriended him. I don't remember. But I remember years ago, right, I friend requested him. Don't know the man personally, but I did friend request him. And every so often, he would post stuff on Facebook. And what would he post? Just pictures of him, his kid, and his wife skiing in the Alps. or him on the French Riviera, or a couple of times a year he's working where he's giving some, TED Talk-like seminar to a bunch of NGO activists in some tragically developed Western European urban center. So I'm like, bro, you're needed at home in your own country. So, this kind of led to the, the disillusionment of many of my own friends who at the time were Otpor members, and they became very, very disillusioned, and it kind of reaffirms this whole apolitical notion. Now let's talk about Soros, right? Let's talk about this whole idea, because a lot of opponents of color revolutions, whether it's Putin or Lukashenko or anybody running Central Asia or whatever, are simply just going to say, well, the opposition is funded by Soros. Right? And that's enough to get, the conspiracy theorists, the QAnon guys, the national conservatives to basically say that this is just the latest example of a Trojan horse movement trying to infiltrate and, muck around in the internal affairs of our country. And yeah, there is noticeable stigma in having your opposition movement funded and supported by international NGOs. I think because the idea that is especially true when, we're looking at the Balkans, even more so in Serbia, because the West is disingenuous. They really don't believe in democracy. They don't believe in representative, true liberal democracy. They believe in propping up and creating pro-Washington, pro-Brussels governments. And that's it. You can be pro-democratic, but you got to be pro-American first. And in many of these situations, you can be pro-American and be absolutely tyrannical at home. And the United States is going to look the other way. And it's, not even so much that the Soros factor is funding the Zelensky government at risk. I mean, basically, the United States is bankrolling the Zelensky government right now. And, you can juxtapose that between it's either them or Russia. But, eventually, the more harm than good is going to happen, and these things usually end up backfiring. I mean, Saakashvili is, at this point, languishing away in a hospital prison. He's basically just holding on at this point. I mean, his political career is, pretty much all but done. So, Western support is very good at funding movements to topple regimes, but they're very poor at changing the nature of governments. Now, it's again, the Western governments will look at certain countries of the former communist East and call them, paragons of democracy. They have a clear vision of reform. And if you know anything about the country, you kind of scratch your head and saying, what country are you looking at? Whether it's Montenegro or Albania or the disputed territory of Kosovo or Saakashvili's Georgia or Poroshenko's Ukraine. Again, if you know nothing about the country beyond the headlines that you read in the New York Times, the Washington Post, or MSNBC, they sound believable. If you know anything about these countries, it's basically the West is just propping up their own puppets. And that's ultimately what it boils down to, unfortunately. So, it's really lost on very few people that protest is instigated from the outside with a clear Western-leaning agenda. So we're not really talking about honest-to-God democracy. We're just simply talking about creating supporting and propping up a government that is more willing to work with one great power in the absence of another great power. Okay? And this is another great example of how weak civil society can be, especially in its disconnect with political society, right? It has no ability at all at holding any of the new governments accountable. So in the end, all this really does is ensure the continuation of top-heavy executive branches that continue to perpetuate the hybrid regime model and make things even worse than in many cases than they were before. So, with all of that said, and there's a lot. There's certainly a lot to cover in this week. And for those of you that are enrolled in class, if you read all four of the articles, right, they're pretty informative, and they do a really, really good job of giving you an overarching assessment of the region. So, if I can finish out with some concluding thoughts by way of moving into more specific politics about Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus next week. I'm going to make a bold statement, right? The Soviet Union didn't really collapse. The Soviet Union did not really collapse. The only thing that collapsed was the political and economic power monopoly of one political party, right? The Communist Party. But most of the top-down heavy institutional bureaucratic apparatus simply went from the Soviet Moscow level to the individual republics, right, that are now independent states. Some democratized, better than others. The Baltics, I think, are an exception, but that's because the Baltics were very early on under the EU spotlight. The second thing is color revolutions are really not revolutions, right? They don't really change anything. It doesn't really do anything. At best, it's a cathartic moment for people to feel safe in the comfort of numbers, saying that the current regime sucks. But the fight for political power does not mean transformative revolution. Right? That is taken directly from the Todorio article. I really, really like that statement. Right? The fight for political power does not mean that you are fighting for democratic power. It does not mean that you are fighting for revolution. It just simply means you want to be in office now. It just simply means you want the perks. You want the parking spots. Right? You want you want first dibs at the trough. And the third thing to note, and this is probably the most important thing to take away, is that entrenched security states, and that's what most of these emerging countries could be classified as, security states. They have learned over the years how to adapt and react to perceived internal challenges and threats against the state. So it's not like these countries are governed by a bunch of aging, tottering, old post-Soviet bureaucrats that are just simply waiting to die. A lot has happened since the later years of the Brezhnev era, where in that case the Politburo was stacked by a bunch of aging old dedushkas. Today, the leadership, I can definitely tell you, in Russia, in Kazakhstan, in Belarus, just to name three, are watching with great interest what had happened in Ukraine, Georgia, and Kyrgyzstan. And they're able to draw a couple of conclusions of their own. All right, the first is the security state was weak. And when it comes to Ukraine, and this is a country that I think has been the most influenced by the West, right? The United States just kind of came, flirted with Georgia, and left. Kyrgyzstan, they couldn't even find that on the map. But Ukraine, it's safe enough to say that significant elements of the Ukrainian security apparatus have already been bought out by the West. Hence the reason why there is this entrenched new type of leadership in Kiev. It's going to be very, very difficult. If, let's say, a pro-Russian government comes to power in Kiev, you're going to need more than just simply a person at the top. You're going to have to effectively clean house and purge the entire state of, pro-Western sycophants. But a weakening security apparatus effectively meant that the patronal networks became competing in and of themselves. So you have networks competing with other networks, trying to vie for power. If the security apparatus is monolithic and omnipresent, right, then nothing happens, right? Then nothing happens. And, there's three examples that I'll explain on how nothing happened. The first two are listed here. The last one just happened a couple of weeks ago. In 2005, Uzbekistan, this is still clearly under the presidency of Islam Karimov, witnessed an uprising, a general social unrest in the eastern part of the country, the Fergana Valley, specifically within the city of Andijan. Now, the Fergana Valley is not only the ethnic heartland of the Uzbek people, but it is also one of the old historical centers of Central Asian Islam. And it's a type of Uzbek Islam that is more militant than the more laid-back Tajik version. regardless of what it was, and there's competing stories behind it, but to get to the point here, Karimov had gone to Andijan to effectively almost beg them to stand down, because if they didn't, he would, and he did, order the National Guard to suppress it. And it was quickly over. We don't know how many people officially died. Officially, the state says somewhere around 150 to 200. Realistically, it could be in the thousands. But it's not a surprise that this took place right after the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan. It's also not a surprise that the Fergana Valley borders Kyrgyzstan. So, contagion, influence, neighborhood effects kind of seep across the border here. So right after Kyrgyzstan, the Uzbek government decides they are clamping down on any visible sign of dissent against the state. Same thing happens, to less violently, but same thing happens in Belarus in 2020. Okay? I don't think that there is an election season yet in which A, Lukashenko has not won with an outright majority, and B, everyone that didn't vote for him is calling foul. This guy basically stays in power after one manipulated election after another, but he doesn't care, because the Belarusian security apparatus is tightly controlled and has direct access to Moscow. So whatever protests were taking place, and, I know that some of my colleagues in academia were getting really emotionally invested in what was happening in Belarus. And I didn't want to ruin it for them, but I'm like, guys, don't take this too seriously. Don't read too much into this. Lukashenko's been around since 94. He ain't going anywhere, anytime soon. And the third example took place about 3 weeks ago in Russia. Right? I'm sure that most of you know about this, right? With the little revolution that didn't, with Yevgeny Prigozhin and about 2/3 of his Wagner private military company, decides just one day he is going to march on Moscow. And, his initial grievances were something like, he wanted to remove certain military officials from the Ministry of Defense. And when Putin said he's not doing that, all of a sudden Prigozhin is like, well, that's it. We're just going to get rid of anybody that stands in my way. And, for about 12 to 18 hours, the world is kind of like literally the war in Ukraine almost stopped. Like people are sort of like checking their phones, checking their Telegram accounts, wondering what's happening. And, Wagner effectively takes over the city of Rostov and continues to just kind of drive north towards Moscow. They're not met with any real resistance. And, the question is, well, what's going to happen when he reaches Moscow? There's no doubt that it's going to fail. But by the time he came within, an hour's drive of Moscow, I think it became clear that this wasn't going to go anywhere, because there was no other elements of the state that was willing to back him. He claimed that there were mass defections within the military. That didn't happen. The security apparatus, and this is the big thing, the FSB, which is the old Soviet KGB, couldn't give him the time of day. And, Putin is somebody who doesn't get angry that much, right? He seems very cool and collective. Say what you want about him, but the guy is really, think less of a statesman and think more of a Corleone. Now, think more of a Tony Soprano in that sense. I'm not even trying to be pejorative here, because all of a sudden, Prigozhin gets a phone call from Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, saying, we need to talk. And the conversation lasted for about a half an hour, 45 minutes tops. We didn't get the full transcript. Apparently, from what Lukashenko said, the first 20 minutes was just one expletive after another. Now, that would be cool for me to translate on my YouTube channel, but that ain't happening. But as all of a sudden, when the phone call is done, Prigozhin stops. He agrees to whatever terms that Lukashenko had conveyed, and he said that he spoke on behalf of Putin. So, like, Lukashenko is almost like Putin's, consigliere in that sense. And, that was it. It was over. We thought that there was going to be a major uprising in Russia. Didn't happen. And a large reason why it didn't happen is because of the Siloviki, because of that security apparatus that did not budge. which is the reason why Putin can afford to be calm and calculating. And, Prigozhin is an outsider. And he may have been given an offer that he couldn't refuse, which basically was, you've got one last chance to back out of this gracefully, or we open fire. And it's going to be messy, but we're going to win in the end. Because one other country did have, and we don't really, I wouldn't call it a color revolution at the time. I think it was just a student protest, but the Tiananmen Square massacres of 1989. Ironically enough, Tiananmen Square happened exactly on the same day as full multi-party elections took place in Poland. So on two bookends of the then communist world, one basically votes out the communist power monopoly. The other one reminds everybody that it ain't going anywhere. Okay? And, the Tiananmen model, which I'm pretty certain Uzbekistan and Russia had used, is very good at controlling the political discourse while continuing to advance economic reform and modernization. Again, this goes back to another thing that we were talking about. A lot of these countries are modernizing without democratizing. And it's not clearly said anywhere, but it's somewhat implied. And that is, to the ordinary person, and, I like to think, the ordinary person in the street, the ordinary person in, the market, the person that, sells vegetables at the Chorsu market in Tashkent, right? And I kind of see these normal people as probably the smartest ones in the entire country. Because for them, I could be wrong, but they don't really get up in the morning upset that the country is not democratic. They don't seem to really be that perturbed that there's no political pluralism. For them, and this is something that a lot of these hybrid regime governments bank on, is that, look, if the quality of life remains on par with the costs of living, right? If, basic necessities like food and fuel and security remain, a guaranteed part of one's life. If one's needs can be met with material goods, consumerism, new shopping malls, social media, all the comforts of modernity without having to go full on liberal democratic, well, then most people are going to be happy with that. Right? And this is kind of the strategy that China played in '89 and seems to be working well today. And that is, it's not democracy that makes people happy. It's just simply a good quality of life. Now, that's not a ringing endorsement for free market capitalism, but it is this idea that the free market gets you stuff. But these states also continue to have an extensive social welfare system, right? I'm not talking about Scandinavian levels here, but, you don't go bankrupt if you get sick. There are, food is relatively cheap and affordable. So it's these things that many of these states have gambled on as a way of promoting and ensuring political longevity. And, that is enough. I think we've covered now almost 2.5 hours. It's more than enough material here for everybody. And if you've been with me up to this point, especially all of my YouTube fans, you guys are troopers. I didn't expect it to go that long, but it certainly developed into a podcast. For those who are enrolled on Canvas, this should be enough material for you to begin your first reading evaluations, as well as to contribute your thoughts and ideas in the comment section. And when we meet for the first time this week on Zoom this Thursday, I think we should have a lot of neat things to talk about. For those of you listening in on YouTube, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, these are the first 2 lectures that I will offer free on my channel. All other lectures I will put on my Patreon page, primarily just as a way of thanking all of my Patreon supporters over the years. I'd like to make some exclusive content for them. Now, if you want to continue to listen and you want to follow me on Patreon, the link is right here. The link is also in the description below. It is a very, very simple Patreon, $5 a month, which, if you think about this, that's basically about $10 to $15 tops for the next 5 weeks. That is the most affordable education that I think you will find in the United States. So please join me on Patreon if you would like to continue listening and also contribute to the conversations. For the rest of you, I will see you next week when we look at the internal politics of Russia and the philosophy of sovereign democracy that is utilized by Vladimir Putin. Stay tuned. See you all then.